Just give them everything, my attorney said quietly. People like that usually destroy themselves when they think they've won. Those words echoed in my mind as I sat at the long walnut conference table and watched my family celebrate what they believed was their greatest victory. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 72 years old, a widow, a mother, a grandmother, and according to the people sitting across from me, little more than an obstacle standing between them and a fortune. Ethan, my only son, couldn't stop smiling. Vanessa, his wife, looked even happier. She had arrived wearing a cream-colored designer jacket and the expression of someone who had already spent money she didn't yet own. Around them sat 2 cousins, a nephew, and several relatives who had suddenly rediscovered their affection for me during the past year. Funny how loneliness attracts company when real estate, investment accounts, and family trusts are involved. The office was located on the 20th floor overlooking downtown Chicago. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Lake Michigan shining beneath the afternoon sun. It should have been a beautiful view. Instead, all I could focus on was the sound of Vanessa's laughter. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Every few minutes, she leaned toward Ethan and whispered something that made them both grin. A year earlier, that would have broken my heart. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. Mom, Ethan said, folding his hands on the table. I know this hasn't been easy for you. His voice carried that rehearsed tone people use when pretending to be compassionate. But we're glad you finally decided to do what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone? Not what's best for me. Not what your father would have wanted. Not what was fair. Just everyone. By everyone, he meant himself. I nodded politely. Of course. Vanessa smiled. It's really the sensible decision. Sensible. Another interesting word. The house my husband and I spent 41 years paying for was sensible. The investment portfolio we built by skipping vacations and working weekends was sensible. The family trust established to protect future generations was sensible. Yet somehow, according to Vanessa, handing all of it over immediately was the most sensible choice of all. Attorney Robert Gaines sat quietly at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. He had handled our family's legal affairs for almost 20 years. He knew my late husband, Charles. He knew how hard we had worked. More importantly, he knew things the people across from me did not. A folder rested neatly beside his elbow. Every few seconds my eyes drifted toward it. Vanessa noticed. Are those the final documents? She asked eagerly. Robert adjusted his glasses. Yes. Her smile widened. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The cousins exchanged satisfied glances. It amazed me how quickly greed erased caution. They weren't nervous. They weren't curious. They were already celebrating. They thought the story was over. The truth was, it hadn't even reached the final chapter. I folded my hands in my lap and remembered the conversation that had changed everything 6 months earlier. A conversation I was never supposed to hear. A conversation that revealed exactly how my family saw me. Not as a mother. Not as a grandmother. Not as the woman who helped build everything they wanted. Just a signature. Just a bank account. Just a date on a future calendar. That memory sat quietly inside me while Robert opened the folder. The room immediately grew still. Papers shifted. Chairs creaked. Outside, a siren echoed faintly through the city streets below. Ethan straightened his tie. Vanessa reached for his hand. Robert glanced around the table, then lowered his eyes to the first page. Very well, he said. Let's begin. And that was the moment they believed they had already won. They had no idea everything depended on the final sentence. 6 months earlier, I was still trying to convince myself that nothing had changed. The signs were there, of course. They always are. But when the people disappointing you are your own family, hope has a way of covering the truth like fresh snow covering a cracked sidewalk. You know the damage is underneath. You just keep pretending it is not. It was early October. The maple trees outside my house were turning shades of gold and red. The mornings had become cooler, and I had settled into the quiet routine that followed Charles's passing. Every morning, I made coffee in the same ceramic mug he had given me on our 30th anniversary. I watered the flowers on the back patio. I read the newspaper at the kitchen table. Some days were lonely, but they were peaceful. At least that is what I told myself. Ethan used to call every few days, then every few weeks. Eventually, his calls became brief check-ins that felt more like obligations than conversations. Vanessa rarely called at all. When she did, the discussion somehow drifted toward property values, investment accounts, or maintenance costs on the house. At first I thought she was making conversation. Later, I realized she was gathering information. One Sunday afternoon, they invited me to dinner. The invitation surprised me because it had been nearly a month since I had seen them. I arrived carrying a homemade apple pie. Olivia opened the door and hugged me immediately. She was the only one who still did. Her warmth reminded me of the little girl who used to spend weekends baking cookies in my kitchen. For a moment, everything felt normal. Dinner was pleasant enough. Ethan talked about work. Vanessa talked about renovations they hoped to make to their home. Olivia discussed college applications. I listened more than I spoke. People reveal a great deal when they believe nobody is paying attention. After dessert, I offered to help clean up. Vanessa insisted she could handle it. I smiled and stepped toward the hallway to retrieve my coat. That was when I heard voices coming from the den. The door was partially open. I had no intention of listening. Then I heard my name. I stopped. Not because I wanted to eavesdrop. Because instinct told me something was wrong. Vanessa was speaking. Her voice carried the confidence of someone discussing a completed project. The house alone is worth over $2 million now, she said. And that is before the trust accounts. Someone laughed quietly. Ethan. My stomach tightened. It will all work out eventually, he replied. We just need patience. There was a pause. Then Vanessa said, something I will never forget. She is the last obstacle. The room fell silent. So did my thoughts. I stood motionless in the hallway holding my coat. Obstacle. Not mother. Not grandmother. Not Margaret. Obstacle. A word people use for traffic. For paperwork. For problems standing in the way of a goal. I waited for Ethan to correct her. To defend me. To remind her I was family. Instead, he chuckled softly. Just do not push too hard, he said. Everything will happen when the time comes. The conversation continued, but I barely heard another word. My heart was not broken in that moment. Strangely, it was something colder than heartbreak. It was clarity. Years of small comments, forgotten invitations, rushed phone calls, and forced smiles suddenly fit together like pieces of a puzzle. I quietly stepped outside through the front door. The evening air felt cold against my face. Across the street, porch lights glowed warmly in the gathering darkness. Families were sitting down for dinner. Televisions flickered through living room windows. Ordinary life continued. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes before turning the key. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was imagining things. For the first time, I accepted that the people waiting to inherit my life's work were already treating me like a problem that needed to disappear. After that evening, I stopped looking for excuses. I stopped telling myself that grief had made everyone distant. I stopped pretending that time would somehow restore what had quietly been lost. Instead, I began paying attention. It was remarkable what people revealed when they believed you were no longer paying attention. Over the following weeks, invitations appeared more frequently. Ethan called twice in 1 week. Vanessa sent friendly text messages asking how I was feeling. She even mailed me a holiday gift basket filled with gourmet snacks and expensive tea. A year earlier, I might have viewed those gestures as kindness. Now they felt like investments. Every conversation seemed to circle the same subjects. The house, the trust, the maintenance costs, property taxes, future planning. They disguised their curiosity behind concern, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Vanessa invited me to lunch at a cafe overlooking the river. The place was elegant, filled with polished wood tables and large windows. She greeted me warmly and ordered my favorite soup before I arrived. It was the kind of thoughtful gesture that should have made me feel loved. Instead, it made me cautious. Halfway through the meal, she casually asked whether I had considered downsizing. I smiled. Not recently. She nodded thoughtfully. A house that size must be difficult for one person. I stirred my soup. Not particularly. Still, she continued, there are wonderful retirement communities these days. Beautiful facilities. Activities. Social events. I noticed she never once asked whether I was happy where I lived. Only whether I planned to stay. When lunch ended, she hugged me and told me how important family was. Then she spent 10 minutes discussing rising real estate values. The contradiction would have been amusing if it had not been so revealing. Around that same time, Olivia began visiting more often. Unlike everyone else, she never asked questions about money. She asked about her grandfather, about old family photographs, about recipes, about stories from before she was born. One Saturday afternoon, we sat together on the back patio drinking lemonade while autumn leaves drifted across the lawn. She noticed an old photograph resting on the table beside me. It showed Charles and me standing in front of our first hardware store nearly 4 decades earlier. "You both look so proud," she said. "We were," I replied. "Your grandfather worked 12-hour days for years building that business." Olivia studied the picture quietly. I wish I could have known him better. Her sincerity nearly brought tears to my eyes. Not because I was sad, because genuine affection had become so rare that I almost forgot what it looked like. As the weeks passed, the contrast grew sharper. Olivia came to spend time with me. Everyone else seemed interested in what would remain after I was gone. Then came Thanksgiving. Ethan insisted on hosting dinner. The house was crowded with relatives. Laughter filled the rooms. Football played on the television. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal. But during dessert, I noticed something. Several family members were discussing renovations they hoped to make someday. One cousin mentioned converting part of the lake property into vacation rentals. Another joked about finally having access to the boat dock. They spoke as though ownership had already changed hands, as though decisions had already been made. Nobody corrected them. Not Ethan. Not Vanessa. I sat quietly and listened. Years earlier, Charles taught me that people often reveal their intentions when they become comfortable. That evening, everyone seemed very comfortable. Driving home later, I thought about the life Charles and I had built together. Every dollar represented sacrifice. Every asset represented decades of work. The realization settled over me like the first snowfall of winter. They did not value what we had built because they had never helped build it. And for the first time, I began wondering whether the inheritance they expected was the inheritance they deserved. The question stayed with me for days. Not whether my family expected an inheritance. Most families do. The question was whether they had begun valuing the inheritance more than the person leaving it behind. There is a difference, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. December arrived with early snow. The neighborhood looked beautiful beneath a blanket of white. Lights appeared on rooftops. Wreaths hung on front doors. Children built snowmen in nearby yards. It should have felt festive. Instead, I found myself reflecting on the years Charles and I spent building our life together. When we opened our first hardware store, we were barely making enough to cover expenses. We worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Charles handled inventory, while I managed bookkeeping and customer accounts. During the first winter, our furnace failed, and we spent 3 nights sleeping under extra blankets because replacing it had to wait until after payroll. We sacrificed vacations. We postponed upgrades. We reinvested nearly everything back into the business. Success did not arrive quickly. It arrived one long day at a time. As those memories returned, another realization surfaced. Ethan had not witnessed most of those struggles. By the time he was old enough to understand money, the hardest years were already behind us. He grew up in a comfortable home. He attended good schools. He never worried about whether the electricity would stay on or whether there would be enough money for groceries. Charles and I wanted that for him. We were proud to provide it. Yet somewhere along the way, comfort had transformed into expectation. A week before Christmas, I received an unexpected visit from Robert Gaines. He stopped by under the pretense of reviewing some trust documents. After we finished discussing paperwork, we sat in the living room drinking coffee. Snow drifted past the windows while the fireplace crackled softly. Robert had known Charles almost as long as I had. He studied me carefully before speaking. "You seem different lately," he said. I smiled. "Different how?" "More observant." I laughed quietly. "That is a polite way of saying less trusting." He nodded. "Perhaps." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question that surprised me. "If Charles were sitting here today, what do you think he would want?" I looked toward the fireplace. The answer came immediately. He would want fairness. Robert leaned back slightly. "Not equality?" "No," I said. "Fairness. There is a difference. Equality gives everyone the same thing. Fairness gives people what they have earned." Robert considered that for a moment. Charles used that exact phrase once. That statement stayed with me long after he left. Fairness. Not equality. Fairness. A few days later, the family gathered for a holiday dinner at Ethan's house. The decorations were beautiful. Music played softly in the background. Wrapped presents filled the space beneath a large Christmas tree. Once again, everything looked perfect from the outside. During the evening, however, I noticed several conversations stopping whenever I entered a room. I noticed meaningful glances exchanged across the table. I noticed Vanessa watching me whenever financial topics arose. Most revealing of all, I noticed how relaxed they had become. They no longer bothered hiding their assumptions. They believed the future belonged to them already. Later that night, Olivia helped me carry gifts to my car. The cold air stung our faces as we walked across the driveway. Before I opened the trunk, she touched my arm. "Grandma," she said softly, "are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. "Why would you ask that?" She hesitated. "Because everyone talks around you lately instead of to you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I hugged her. It was a simple observation, but it confirmed something important. I was not imagining any of it. Someone else saw it too. As I drove home through the falling snow, I realized I was no longer trying to decide whether a problem existed. The real question had become something entirely different. If fairness mattered more than equality, what would fairness actually look like when the time finally came to decide who deserved my legacy? The answer arrived sooner than I expected. January brought bitter cold and gray skies. Snow lined the edges of the driveway in uneven piles, and most mornings began with a layer of frost covering the windows. I spent more time indoors, sorting old photographs and organizing boxes that had not been opened in years. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that I found a notebook Charles had kept near the end of his life. It was not a diary. Charles was not the kind of man who wrote long reflections. Instead, it contained brief notes, business ideas, reminders, and occasional observations. Most of the entries were practical: inventory numbers, meeting schedules, charitable donations. Then I found a sentence written in his unmistakable handwriting. "Character reveals itself when people believe nobody is watching." I stared at those words for a long time. They felt less like a memory and more like a warning delivered across time. A week later, another family gathering provided exactly the proof I needed. Ethan invited several relatives to his house to watch a playoff football game. I attended because Olivia asked me to come. The atmosphere was relaxed. Food covered the kitchen counters. People moved between rooms carrying drinks and snacks. Television commentators filled the background with constant noise. At some point during the afternoon, I stepped outside to get a little fresh air. The cold was sharp enough to sting my lungs. I walked along the side of the house toward the patio. As I rounded the corner, voices drifted through a partially open basement window. I immediately recognized Vanessa. "I am telling you, once everything is settled, we should sell the lake property first," she said. Another relative agreed. Then came Ethan's voice. "The house will probably be next. There is too much value tied up in it." I stopped walking. My expression did not change. My heartbeat did. They were discussing assets that did not belong to them. Not someday. Not hypothetically. They were speaking as though ownership had already transferred. As though the decisions were already theirs to make. Then Vanessa laughed. "Honestly, maintaining all of that would be a headache anyway." A headache. I thought about the summers Charles spent repairing docks with his own hands. I thought about family gatherings at the lake. Birthdays. Anniversaries. Holiday weekends. Decades of memories reduced to a headache. I quietly walked back toward the front yard before anyone noticed I had overheard them. Inside, I found Olivia setting out dessert plates. She smiled when she saw me. "Grandma, can you help me with these?" For the next 20 minutes, we carried dishes to the dining room together. Nobody discussed property values. Nobody mentioned trusts. Nobody asked about future distributions. We talked about her classes, her volunteer work, and the internship she hoped to secure during the summer. The contrast was impossible to miss. One conversation centered on what could be taken. The other centered on what could be built. That evening, after returning home, I sat alone in my living room. Snowflakes drifted past the windows beneath the glow of the porch light. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that encourages honesty. For months, I had been gathering pieces of a puzzle. Small comments, careless assumptions, revealing conversations. Individually, each one might have been dismissed. Together, they formed a picture that could no longer be ignored. The question was no longer whether changes needed to be made. The question was how. I picked up the phone and stared at Robert Gaines's business card resting beside the lamp. Charles had trusted him. I trusted him too. The next morning, I called his office and requested a private meeting. When his assistant asked whether the matter was urgent, I looked out the window at the frozen landscape and answered with complete certainty. "Yes," I said. I believe it is. Robert scheduled the meeting for the following Tuesday. The morning was cold and clear, with sunlight reflecting off snowbanks that lined the streets. As I drove downtown, I felt surprisingly calm. Months earlier, I might have approached the meeting with anger or sadness. Those emotions had already done their work. What remained was clarity. Robert's office occupied the same floor it had for years. The receptionist greeted me warmly and escorted me into a private conference room overlooking the city. Robert arrived carrying a leather folder and a cup of coffee. After a few minutes of polite conversation, he closed the door and took a seat across from me. "You sounded concerned on the phone," he said. I folded my hands together. "I am not concerned anymore." He raised an eyebrow. "No. Concern means uncertainty. I am certain now." For a moment, he studied my expression. Then he nodded. "Tell me." So I did. I told him about the dinner conversation. I told him about the comments regarding the house and lake property. I told him about being described as an obstacle. I spoke calmly, without exaggeration or bitterness. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he remained silent for several seconds. "I wish I could say I am surprised," he finally said. "But I am not." That answer did not shock me. Somehow it made me feel less alone. Robert opened the folder. Inside were copies of trust documents, estate plans, property records, and amendments Charles and I had signed over the years. Decades of work reduced to organized stacks of paper. "Before we discuss options," he said, "I need to ask an important question. What outcome do you want?" I looked at the documents. "I want fairness." A faint smile appeared on his face. "The same word you used before." "Because it is still the right word." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Then we should talk about what fairness actually means." The next hour became one of the most important conversations of my life. We discussed responsibilities, values, legacy, not just money, legacy. Charles always believed wealth was a tool, not a reward. He believed money should support character, not replace it. The more we talked, the more certain I became that the existing plan no longer reflected that principle. Several times Robert asked whether I wanted to remove people completely. Each time I shook my head. This was not about punishment. It was about truth. Eventually, he slid a blank legal pad across the table. "Then tell me who has demonstrated the values you want your legacy to represent." The answer came easily. I thought about Olivia volunteering at local shelters during college breaks. I thought about her spending entire afternoons listening to stories about her grandfather. I thought about the way she never once asked what she might inherit. Not once. Meanwhile, others seemed unable to discuss family without eventually discussing assets. By the end of the meeting, a framework had begun to take shape. Robert outlined several legal mechanisms that could accomplish my goals. Trust structures, conditional distributions, long-term protections. Every option was carefully designed and entirely lawful. Yet one particular idea caught my attention. It was simple, elegant, and most importantly, it would reveal character without requiring me to accuse anyone of anything. "Interesting," I said quietly. Robert nodded. "Very interesting." Neither of us smiled. We did not need to. The plan was not revenge. It was something much more powerful. It would allow people to reveal exactly who they were. As the meeting ended, Robert gathered the documents and placed them back inside the folder. "There is no need to rush," he said. "Take time to think." I stood and reached for my coat. "I already have." Walking back to the elevator, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because any documents had changed yet. Not because any decisions were final. I felt lighter because for the first time since Charles passed away, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The only thing left was deciding when to do it. Over the next several weeks, I made no visible changes. That was the most important part. People become cautious when they sense resistance. They become careless when they believe they are winning. So I smiled. I attended family dinners. I answered phone calls. I listened patiently whenever conversations drifted toward future plans. Meanwhile, Robert quietly prepared documents behind the scenes. Spring arrived earlier than expected that year. Snow melted from the sidewalks, and patches of green began appearing across lawns throughout the neighborhood. The warmer weather seemed to lift everyone's spirits, especially Ethan and Vanessa. Their confidence grew with each passing week. I noticed it in small ways at first. Vanessa began speaking more openly about home renovations. One evening during dinner, she mentioned expanding their kitchen. "We are thinking about knocking down a wall," she said casually. The contractor says it would completely transform the space. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. It is probably time. I smiled and took a sip of iced tea. Neither mentioned how expensive the project would be. Neither explained where the money might come from. They simply spoke as though resources would appear when needed. Another afternoon, I overheard a conversation about vacation properties in Florida. A cousin discussed waterfront communities. Someone joked about future retirement plans. Once again, nobody spoke in possibilities. They spoke in assumptions. It was as though my estate had already been distributed in their minds. Yet while some family members focused on imagined wealth, Olivia continued moving in the opposite direction. She secured a competitive summer internship through hard work and persistence. She volunteered on weekends. She called simply to check on me. One Saturday, she arrived carrying groceries after learning I had been dealing with a minor cold. "You should not be lifting heavy bags right now," she said. I laughed. I survived 40 years in retail. That does not mean you should carry everything yourself. Together we unpacked groceries while discussing her plans after graduation. Not once did money enter the conversation. Not once did she mention property, trusts, or inheritance. Watching her move through the kitchen reminded me of Charles. Not because they shared the same personality, because they shared the same values. Responsibility, humility, gratitude, qualities that cannot be purchased and cannot be inherited through paperwork alone. Several days later, Robert invited me back to his office for a final review. We spent nearly 2 hours examining documents. Every detail had been carefully prepared. Every possibility had been considered. By the time we finished, the structure was complete. Fair, lawful, thoughtful. Most importantly, it aligned with everything Charles and I had worked for. As I prepared to leave, Robert closed the final folder. "Once these are signed, there is no confusion about your intentions." I nodded. "Good. You understand some people may not be pleased." I smiled slightly. "The people who care about me will understand. The people who care only about money probably will not." Robert laughed quietly. "That may be the most accurate legal assessment I have heard all year." The documents were signed that afternoon. No announcements were made. No confrontations occurred. Life continued exactly as before, at least on the surface. The following month brought another family gathering. As usual, everyone appeared warm and welcoming. Yet beneath the smiles, I sensed growing anticipation. It reminded me of people waiting outside a theater before a major performance. They believed something important was coming. The difference was that they thought they already knew how the story ended. Late that evening, as guests prepared to leave, Vanessa approached me near the front door. "You know," she said with a friendly smile, "it must feel good having everything organized." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Your affairs, your plans, all those important documents." Her tone was light, but her eyes were searching for information. I returned her smile. "Yes," I said. "Everything is organized." She seemed satisfied with that answer. The truth was, everything was organized. More organized than she could possibly imagine. And when the time came for those documents to be opened, certain people were going to discover that confidence and certainty are not always the same thing. The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Robert adjusted the papers in front of him and continued reading. Across the table, Ethan appeared relaxed. Vanessa looked almost cheerful. The cousins exchanged confident glances. They were hearing exactly what they expected to hear. The house, the investment accounts, the lake property, the trust assets. Each item was carefully listed and accounted for. Nobody interrupted. Nobody asked questions. They sat there absorbing every word like people listening to the confirmation of a future they had already spent years imagining. I remained silent. My hands rested calmly in my lap. Months earlier, I might have felt nervous. Now I felt only curiosity. I wanted to see how people reacted when expectation met reality. Robert turned another page. "The distribution of assets shall proceed according to the provisions outlined in the trust documents and amendments executed by Margaret Whitmore." Vanessa leaned slightly forward. Ethan's expression sharpened with attention. Robert continued reading. Several family members nodded as individual properties and accounts were referenced. Everything still sounded familiar. Everything still sounded predictable. That was the beauty of patience. The most important changes rarely announced themselves immediately. Then Robert reached the final section. I noticed it at once. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief, and read the paragraph again before speaking aloud. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty entered the room. "There is an additional provision," he said. Vanessa frowned slightly. Ethan straightened in his chair. Robert continued. "Margaret Whitmore directs that all major distributions from the family trust shall be administered according to the legacy stewardship clause established in the final amendment." The room remained silent. Nobody seemed concerned yet, most likely because nobody understood what that meant. Robert proceeded carefully. "The purpose of the clause is to ensure that inherited assets remain connected to demonstrated responsibility, service, and preservation of family values." Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. Confusion replaced confidence. Robert continued reading. "Eligibility for unrestricted distributions shall be determined by the independent trustee based upon documented evidence of community contribution, financial responsibility, and sustained commitment to family stewardship." One cousin blinked repeatedly. Another shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ethan frowned. "What exactly does that mean?" Robert calmly looked down at the document. "It means distributions are not automatic." The words landed heavily. Vanessa immediately leaned forward. "Not automatic?" Robert shook his head. "No," he returned to the document. "The amendment specifically states that inheritance is intended to reward demonstrated character rather than assumed entitlement." Nobody spoke. I could almost see the sentence settling into the room. Character rather than assumed entitlement. The phrase came directly from the conversations Robert and I had shared months earlier. It reflected everything Charles believed. Everything I believed. Robert continued reading. "The trustee shall evaluate recipients according to established criteria outlined within the trust administration guidelines." Ethan's face had lost all color. Vanessa stared at the document as though it might somehow change if she looked hard enough. The cousins who had spent years discussing future assets suddenly appeared far less comfortable. Meanwhile, Olivia looked genuinely surprised. Not upset, simply surprised. Because unlike the others, she had never been planning her future around money she did not possess. Robert finished reading the final sentence and carefully placed the document on the table. No one spoke for several seconds. The confidence that had filled the room earlier seemed to vanish all at once. Every assumption, every expectation, every private conversation about future ownership suddenly depended on something none of them expected to be measured. Character. Finally, Vanessa broke the silence. "Who approved this?" Robert folded his hands. "Margaret did." For the first time that afternoon, every eye in the room turned toward me. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. I looked around the table and saw expressions I had not seen before. Surprise, confusion, calculation. For months, perhaps years, certain people had believed the future was already decided. Now they were discovering that assumptions are not the same as guarantees. Ethan was the first to speak. "Mom, why would you do this?" His voice remained controlled, but I could hear the frustration underneath. I met his eyes calmly. "Because your father and I spent our entire lives building something valuable." Vanessa folded her arms. "So now people have to pass some kind of test?" Robert answered before I could. "The amendment establishes standards, not tests." "That sounds like the same thing," she replied. Robert shook his head. "Not legally, and not practically." Once again, silence settled over the room. I noticed something interesting. Nobody was asking about preserving family values. Nobody was asking how the process worked. Nobody seemed curious about the charitable provisions or stewardship guidelines. The only concern was access. Olivia remained quiet beside the window. She looked thoughtful rather than upset. Eventually, she turned toward me. "Grandma, is this what you wanted?" Her question was sincere. Not defensive, not strategic. Sincere. I smiled. "Yes." She nodded once and accepted the answer. That simple response told me more than any speech could have. The meeting continued for another half hour while Robert explained administrative details. Some relatives asked questions. Others barely listened. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier they had arrived expecting a celebration. Now they were confronting uncertainty. When everything finally concluded, chairs slid back from the table and people began gathering their belongings. Nobody seemed eager to linger. Vanessa left first. Ethan followed shortly afterward. Several relatives avoided eye contact altogether. I did not stop them. There was nothing left to argue about. The documents were valid. The decisions were final. More importantly, the principles behind them were clear. As the room gradually emptied, Olivia approached me. "Would you like company for lunch?" she asked. I laughed softly. After all of this? Especially after all of this. We ended up spending the afternoon at a small restaurant near the lake. The conversation had nothing to do with trusts or inheritance. We talked about her career goals, her plans after graduation, the volunteer program she hoped to join. As I listened, I found myself thinking about Charles. He would have liked this moment. Not because of the legal outcome, because of what it revealed. Legacy had never been about transferring assets. Legacy was about transferring values. Months passed after that meeting. Predictably, some relatives lost interest in frequent visits. Phone calls became less common. Invitations arrived less often. Strangely, I did not feel disappointed. Their absence answered questions that words never could. Meanwhile, Olivia remained exactly the same. She continued building her future one step at a time. She continued showing up. She continued caring. Not because she expected a reward, because that was who she was. Looking back now, I realized the most valuable thing I left behind was not property, money, or investments. It was a choice to protect the values that created those things in the first place. Wealth can disappear. Houses can be sold. Accounts can be spent. Character lasts longer. On the day Charles and I started our first business, we had almost nothing except determination and faith in each other. Those qualities created everything that followed. It seemed only right that those same qualities should matter in the end. As for me, I left that conference room with complete peace of mind. Not because everyone agreed with my decision. They did not. Not because everyone was happy. They were not. I left with peace because for the first time since losing Charles, I knew our life's work would be measured by the standards that built it. And sometimes, that is the most meaningful inheritance of all.